following program, Search the Scriptures, is brought to you by the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Speakers are Keith Sharp and Trevor Campbell. We invite you to call or write the church to submit questions for the speakers to answer. We'll provide answers from the Bible to your questions.
Well, Trevor, what can you tell me about Babylon?
Well, we can talk quite a bit about Babylon since the Bible mentions it quite often.
Yes, there's a lot in the Bible about Babylon. Good evening. I'm Keith Sharp, the preacher at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ. And with me on the program, my full partner is Trevor Campbell. I'm going to let Trevor introduce himself.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Trevor Campbell, and I preach at the Payette Church of Christ, located on Highway 62 in Payette. And on the screen there, you'll see our meeting times, and we meet on Sunday mornings. And there's a phone number there as well, 870-435-2737. That's my number. You can give me a call there if you have a question for the program or if you have a question about the church there or what we practice there. So if you're in Marion County, give us a call or come out and visit us. We'd love to have you.
And of course, I'm Keith Sharp, and I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. We invite you to come to our services. Now, of course, the services, as most everybody, have been altered because of the coronavirus pandemic. We now are having our Sunday morning service at 11 o'clock only. There's no 10 o'clock classes. There's no 2 o'clock assembly, just meeting at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. And then we're also meeting, we just started back meeting on Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock, an abbreviated service then. And we have our ladies class started back. So that's the three services that we have at the present time, at 11 a.m. on Sunday, 7 p.m. on Wednesday, and then our ladies class at 10 a.m. On Wednesday. And we invite the ladies to come to that class. We meet 1 mile south of the Highway 62 412 bypass. As you're going south towards Salesville, it would be on the left, the Highway 5 South Church of Christ. We do invite you to our services, and we are practicing all of the guidelines that the governor's given during the coronavirus crisis that we can protect ourselves from being infected. So we invite you to come out if you possibly can. We invite your questions. The subject matter of this program is generated by the questions that you have. And so if you have a question for us, we invite you to call us. You can call me, Keith Sharp, at 870-321-5746. Or you can email me at keithsharp@suddenlink.net. Or if you prefer, you can write a letter to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. And we will answer your question from the Scriptures. We're not going to give you our opinions. We're going to show you what the Scriptures say. And so we'll answer from the Scriptures the question that you have. We do urge you to send us your question so we can talk about that. Trevor, anything you want to add before we get into our subject matter?
No, sounds good.
You're good to go, huh?
Ready to go.
All right. Okay. Well, we have a question concerning Babylon. The question is, how does the role of Babylon differ from the Old Testament to the New Testament? Well, that gives us a lot of room to roam. So, Trevor, why don't you start us out on that?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so, Babylon, the Babylonian Empire was a world empire, and it was around, as the New Testament. And it was around during the time that the Old Testament was being written. I'm going to go to Habakkuk, the book of Habakkuk, just to start, Keith. In chapter 1 of Habakkuk, Babylon is mentioned here. And you're going to see the word Chaldeans, or the name Chaldeans. Now, that's the Babylonians. That's the people of the Babylonian Empire. But God used this nation, and that's what we see in the Old Testament a lot of with Babylon, is God raising them up and using them to punish His own nation, Israel, because of their sins. But in Habakkuk chapter 1, and I'm going to begin just at verse 5 here. God says, "Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told you. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses also are swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. Then he changes his mind, and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. All right, so that's a brief description there. God talking to Habakkuk and to the people about this Babylonian Empire that God, as he says, he was raising up. And I think that's an important point in this text, is verse 5, where he says, I will work a work in your days. So God's bringing these things about. And then in verse 6, I am indeed raising up the Chaldeans. So God was bringing all this about, and he was going to use this mighty empire, this mighty nation. And one of the ways he used them was to punish his own people as a result of their sins. So that kind of kicks us off with Babylon there, Keith.
Okay. And of course, that is a reference to the literal city of Babylon.
Yeah, that's right.
Which was the capital of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans was the name of the people, and Babylon was the city.
Right.
That was the capital city of the Chaldean Empire. And as Trevor said, it was a world empire in ancient times. Now, if you look on a map that would be of this time, you would see it would actually would be primarily the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. But eventually it came over under Nebuchadnezzar, and he's the one who captured Jerusalem after defeated Pharaoh Necho at the Battle of Carchemish, which was about 610 BC, and that established Babylon as the great world power. They had defeated the Assyrians and the Egyptians, and they were the greatest power of the Middle East, which to the Jews was the world. And so this was the world of the Jews that the Babylonians ruled over, beginning in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and they had that empire for a little bit over 70 years. Which was, of course, is a figure that was given by Jeremiah the time that the Jews were to be in Babylonian captivity, and was literally fulfilled. They were indeed in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And so it was the great world power, and the Old Testament reference to Babylon, references, and I made a note, I think there's about 288 times the word Babylon occurs in the Old Testament, and Trevor noted the fact the Chaldeans, and I didn't even look up the word Chaldeans, the number of times that it's used in the Old Testament. So it's a very common reference in the Old Testament. The city of Babylon was an amazingly huge city. From what I've read from historians, is the city of Babylon was about 60 miles in circumference. And had walls, the size of the walls almost staggered the imagination. Incredibly wealthy and huge city. So at the time that Isaiah wrote his book, the Babylonians were actually a part of the Assyrian Empire. And in that battle of Carchemish in about 610 BC, and we can read about this, by the way, in 2 Kings chapter 24, where Pharaoh Necho was going to the north to meet the king of Babylon to fight against him. And Pharaoh Necho was in league with the king of Assyria. And they fought against Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and they lost. And the Babylonians became the great world empire. And so that city was so enormous and so powerful that it is hard to imagine. Now, I want to go to an Old Testament reference that actually occurred before. Now, probably, we don't know for sure when the book of Habakkuk was written that Trevor referred to, but probably, just taking from the subject matter, the book of Habakkuk was probably written shortly before the Babylonians invaded Judah and conquered Judah. But we can't prove that. That's just from the subject matter in the book. But the book of Isaiah was written about a century before this. And so this would be one of the early references to the city of Babylon. In Isaiah chapter 13, Isaiah has to say some things to say about Babylon, and what he does is fulfill the utter destruction of the city. He prophesies in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 1, the burden against Babylon, which Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw. Now that's the literal city of Babylon, the most powerful city in the world. Now, at the time that Isaiah wrote, Nineveh was the world capital, or of that part of the world of the Jews. The Assyrian Empire had conquered everything around except little tiny Judah itself, and they overthrew even the Israelites in the northern kingdom, but not Judah, not Hezekiah, king of Judah. The Lord protected them. But Babylon was a mighty city, but it was a city that was eventually to overthrow Nineveh and Assyria and to become the great world empire. But Isaiah wrote before that happened. But he's writing concerning this great city Babylon. Look at Isaiah chapter 13, verse 9. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. Now, when you read the day of the Lord in the Old Testament, that's a day of judgment. Well, this was judgment on Babylon. And that's a judgment that took place in 536, but then repeated itself over a period of time. And Isaiah prophesies that Babylon would be so utterly destroyed that there would be nothing left there as far as the city. In Isaiah chapter 13, verse 17, he says, Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, who will not regard silver, and as for gold, they will not delight in it. Well, Cyrus was of Media. He was a Mede, and he combined the Medes and the Persians, and they invaded Babylon in 536, and they overthrew it. And so Jeremiah is writing over 150 years before this happened and predicting who would do it. In fact, later in Isaiah chapters 44 and 45, he even names Cyrus by name, even though Cyrus would be born a century or so after the time that Isaiah wrote. So this is a wonderful example of biblical predictive prophecy that shows the inspiration of the Scriptures. And then in Isaiah chapter 13, verses 19 through 21, Isaiah says, And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride. Remember what Trevor said concerning Chaldeans? That's the people. They're the people called Chaldeans. Their capital is Babylon. And so he says, he would stir up against them, and Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, of course, there was nothing left of Sodom and Gomorrah. They were completely overcome. It did not immediately happen. It took centuries for that once great, proud city, which had one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which was built by Nebuchadnezzar, and the great city walls that were unbreachable. But nonetheless, Cyrus conquered the city. Eventually, it fell into decay, and whereas today, as Isaiah prophesies in Isaiah chapter 13, there's nothing left of the city, and nobody lives there, and even the Arabs that dwell in that area will not even spend the night there. So you can read Isaiah, the rest of Isaiah chapter 13. All of that was fulfilled. That's the literal city of Babylon that it's talking about. Well, Trevor, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Well, I thought that was good. I had chapter 13 of Isaiah in mind as well. And like you mentioned, it shows the inspiration of the Scriptures, God prophesying about these things through Isaiah well before they happened.
Right.
So that's amazing. But also in Isaiah, you mentioned Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, and that's another passage I had down was chapter 39 of Isaiah, where God tells Hezekiah what he's going to do with Babylon and how it's going to affect Jerusalem and its people. In Isaiah chapter 39 and verse 5, it says, Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming, when all that is in your house, and what your fathers have accumulated until this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. All right, so that again, another prophecy well in advance about what was going to take place and how God was going to use Babylon. And again, in that first passage we looked at in Habakkuk chapter 1, God said, I'm going to work a work in your days, and I'm going to raise up this nation, and he did. And he used them, and this is one of the ways he used them. We see it here that he's predicting or prophesying ahead of time that all these things can be carried away from Babylon, including their own children. In verse 7 he says, "And they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." So talking about the slavery that would take place and the taking of the kings during that time. So there another prophecy about what was to take place, and also we're getting to see what was the question again exactly?
Well, just tell us about Babylon.
Yeah, how Babylon was used, if you will, and this is one of the ways they were used.
Okay, and so again, an Old Testament reference, and again, Trevor, I haven't counted the number of times the word Chaldeans is used in the Old Testament, the word Babylon 288 times, and so far as I could discern, every time that word Babylon is used, it's of the literal city of Babylon. It's not a figurative thing, it's a literal thing, the city of Babylon itself, and then the Chaldeans referenced them. Trevor was making reference to the invasion of Judah by the Babylonians that took place after Hezekiah was dead and gone. In fact, after Josiah, his grandson, was dead and gone, then Babylon came down, and under three different kings of Judah, there were three conquests that Nebuchadnezzar made of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar tried to spare Jerusalem, but they just wouldn't be good and submit to him. They kept rebelling, and he kept coming back and conquering them again. He first conquered them in 605 or 606, depending on who you're reading. And then when they rebelled again, he came back in 596. And by the way, in the 605 is when Daniel was taken down to Babylon as a captive, along with other probably teenage boys that were taken down there. And you can read about that in Daniel chapter 1. And the book of Daniel was written in Babylon, where Daniel was an advisor to the king. And actually to kings, because he outlived Nebuchadnezzar and outlived Nebuchadnezzar's son and perhaps his grandson, and wrote the book of Daniel from Babylon. And then in the second time, that's probably when Ezekiel was taken into captivity, and the book of Ezekiel was written from down next to Babylon, where the Jews were in captivity by the river Chebar, which was next to Babylon, down in the land of the Chaldeans, and then again in 686. So he invaded and conquered in 610, or excuse me, 605 to 66, in 596 and in 586. Three different conquests, and finally, and you can read all about this in 2 Kings, chapters 24 and 25, and finally, in that third invasion that took place in 586, Nebuchadnezzar completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem. He destroyed the temple. He destroyed all the leaders of the Jews except for the king Zedekiah. He put out his eyes after he'd seen his own sons killed in front of him, put his eyes out and took him into Babylonian captivity. And then Babylon itself is destroyed by Cyrus in 536, and the Jews were allowed to return from Babylonian captivity. So Babylon had an enormous impact on Old Testament Israel. All right, Trevor, is there more you'd like to say about the Old Testament usage of the word Babylon?
Well, just a bit maybe. You know, you mentioned the different conquests that took place there with Nebuchadnezzar, and of course also in the book of Jeremiah. You've got Jeremiah in the city of Babylon, or city of Jerusalem, excuse me, telling the people to surrender. That was what God had told them. That was the message to give to the people before that final conquest, was surrender and you'll live. And they refused. And they were very foolish to do so. And I've got a passage in Jeremiah chapter 22 that I'd like to take a look at. This is regarding God destroying the city of Jerusalem, using that Babylonian Empire, using King Nebuchadnezzar. And in verse 8 of Jeremiah 22:8, it says, "And many nations will pass by this city," that's the city of Jerusalem, "and everyone who will say to his neighbor, 'Why has the Lord done so to this great city?' Then they will answer, 'Because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord their God and worshipped other gods and served them.'" So there's the reason, that God, raised up this nation and used them against his own people, against the nation of Israel, was because of their unfaithfulness. So I had to glance back and see what the question was. It's how does the role of Babylon change from the old to the new? We see the role of Babylon. We see what God did with them and how he used them there in the Old Testament text. And as you mentioned, there's a number of passages you could look at. You go to the book of Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. There's so many to look at. We just don't have the time to do so.
Right.
But on your own time, good stuff to look at.
Right.
And to see that God's judgments are real. And we have to take God's word seriously. They didn't take his word seriously. The people of Judah and Jerusalem, and as a result, God used the Babylonians to destroy them.
Thanks, Trevor, and thanks for bringing up Jeremiah. That's an important book to keep in mind. Of course, Jeremiah's role was to try to save the Jews at the time that Babylon was the world ruler by them submitting to God and simply surrendering and accepting the fact that the judgment had come upon them because of their unfaithfulness. But they refused to listen to Jeremiah, and they were utterly destroyed as the result. And by the way, the same destruction that you read about in 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25 is also recorded in the last chapters of Jeremiah. And so that had a huge impact on the nation of the Jews. It was one of the low points in the history of the nation of the Jews. Well, all right. Well, that's all the references that I would note from the Old Testament concerning Babylon. As I say, 288 references to the city itself, and I didn't count the references to the Chaldeans. But now there are 12 New Testament times that the word Babylon occurs. So let's take a look at them. Trevor, start us out, please.
All right. Well, I'll go to one that's just simple, I think, that just basically mentions the city itself, and that's in 1 Peter chapter 5. There was a church there in the city of Babylon. Now, Babylon itself and the city of Babylon had pretty much come to nothing. It wasn't much left there, and in fact, according to secular history, there's really not much mention, even in this time period, hereafter about the city of Babylon. There just wasn't really anything there. Today, of course, you can go visit the ruins that are still there. But in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13, Peter ends the letter here, his letter, with, "She who is in Babylon, elect together with you, greets you, and so does Mark my son." And all he's referencing there is just from the church at Babylon. She, in other words, the church from Babylon, greets you. And of course, if you went back to chapter 1 of 1 Peter, you see that there are pilgrims, Christians, he calls them pilgrims of the dispersion, in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. And that's probably why there was also a church in Babylon. I believe that's a physical reference there to Babylon, and that many of the Christians had to disperse because of the persecution by the Jewish nation upon them. And so they were dispersed and they were scattered abroad, and apparently one of those places that some of them went was to Babylon, and it seems that either Peter wrote from there or had recently been with them, since he says the church in Babylon greets you. So there's a reference right there.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. And I concur with Trevor. Many people take the position that the word Babylon there in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, is a figurative reference to the city of Rome. But unless something in the context or something in the language itself forces us to take a term figuratively, then we would take it to be literally what he's talking about. And as Trevor pointed out, the city of Babylon, although it had become a very minor city by that time, was still in existence at that time. It did cease to exist later on, but it was still in existence at that time. And so I don't see any reason to take in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, anything other than a literal reference to the city of Babylon itself in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. But then we have a number of references in the book of Revelation to Babylon. And so before we are out of time with the program, let's begin to take a look at those references in the book of Revelation to Babylon. Trevor, again, I'm going to let you start us out on that, please.
Oh, okay. Well, in Revelation, there is a reference in chapter 14. I wrote down several references. I don't know that I wrote them all down. But in chapter 14 and in verse 8, it says, "And another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she has made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Now, I don't know what Keith's going to say about this. It's probably going to be a little different than what I'm going to say about it. But, I believe this to be Jerusalem here that he's talking about, the fall of Jerusalem. Just prior to this, in chapter 11, and also in verse 8, but chapter 11, verse 8, he refers to the great city here, and he makes it clear that the great city is Jerusalem. He says, "And their dead bodies will lie in the streets of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified." So the great city here was where Jesus was crucified, being Jerusalem. And then as you go through the book, he refers to this great city, but from here on he calls it Babylon. And what's interesting to me, since we're talking about the role of Babylon in the Old and the role of Babylon in the New Testament, is that God here is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and referring to it as the great city of Babylon, which also fell. And we read earlier today, Keith actually read it, back in chapter 13 of Isaiah, where God talks about the Medes overtaking Babylon. And he says, Babylon will become like Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, here we have that same type of reference of this time Jerusalem being made like Sodom in chapter 11 and verse 8. And again, the great city being referred to as Sodom, also Babylon further on in the book. So that may be all I'll say for now, Keith. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, we're running short on the program, and so I'm going to cut my remarks on this short also, but let me give to the audience, and if you have a Bible concordance, you can look this up on your own, and just look for the word Babylon, and look in the book of Revelation, and you have just as much ability as Trevor or I to draw conclusions concerning what it's talking about. Obviously, it's not talking about the literal city of Babylon, which had become a minor town by that time. It was not a great city. Some think it was a reference to Jerusalem. Some, and I take the position that it's a reference to Rome, and a lot of take that same position. But regardless, let me just give you some passages for you to look at. You can draw your own conclusion. That I want to draw a conclusion that I think we should be able to agree on. Here's some further references in the book of Revelation to the city of Babylon. Chapter 17, verse 5, verse 9, verse 18. And then look again in chapter 18, verses 2, 9 and 10, 20, and 24. These are references to the destruction of Babylon the Great. Well, whether it's talking about Rome or whether it's talking about Jerusalem, is talking about a great world power that was persecuting God's people and who had become exceedingly wicked. And it was going to be destroyed, and God's people were going to be victorious. And I believe that's the lesson for we all should learn from the book of Revelation, that regardless of what a great world power we have to face, we may get to the point in our country where we're persecuted by the government. If we will be faithful, eventually persecuting powers will be overthrown. God's people will be victorious. Trevor, I know we're about out of time. I'm going to let you conclude the program.
All right. Well, that was good. I appreciate what you had to say there. I don't think I have much time to say anything, so I'll go ahead and say goodnight. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, give us a call, write us, email us, however you want to contact us if you have a question for the program. Thanks for joining us. Good night.
Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. If you have a Bible question or comment, you may call 870-321-5746, email keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or write Keith Sharp at P.O. Box 263, Mountain Home, Arkansas 72654. And your question will be answered on the air. Be sure to watch next week at the same time for another edition of Search the Scriptures. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.